Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? One sentence at Thanksgiving sent my whole family into meltdown, and I did not raise my voice once. Can you guess what happened next? I walked into that house fully aware that the day was going to be tense because every holiday with my family comes with its own unspoken rules, but I still thought I could manage it if I kept my head down and just went through the motions. My husband Ethan squeezed my hand as we stepped inside, and I tried to convince myself that this year would not be as bad as the last, yet within minutes it was clear I had been lying to myself. From the very start, I felt the shift. Chairs around the main table were being called out by name, plates were set with care, and as people began settling in, my aunt announced cheerfully that parents with kids should sit in the center, while others could take the side table. That alone was enough to sting, but I bit my tongue because I had learned that making a fuss never leads anywhere good. It was Uncle Ray, never one to miss a chance at a dig, who muttered loudly that it was about time the kidless crowd learned their place. Everyone laughed, and I smiled tightly, even though my stomach was burning. It was right after that when my mother delivered the line that changed everything. With her polished voice and that half-smile she wears when she is pretending to be kind, but actually twisting the knife, she said, "You do not belong at Thanksgiving without kids." The room went quiet for just a second before the noise picked back up again, and I sat frozen, looking at her, unable to tell if she had truly said what I thought I had heard. Ethan looked at me with this calm, steady expression, but his jaw had tightened, and he whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Do you know your true worth?" I think in that moment something inside me snapped into clarity, because instead of fighting back or crying or trying to defend myself, I just shut down any instinct to argue and went silent. While everyone else was distracted with drinks and chatter, I noticed something else that made my pulse spike. On the counter, there was a glass jar labeled "Family Fund for the New Baby," and guests were slipping envelopes inside. I remembered all too clearly the last time I saw a jar like that, which had been at my wedding years ago, where relatives contributed as a way to help with expenses, only to be told later by my mother that the money had been redirected for something more important. At the time I let it go because I told myself family mattered more than money, but standing there watching my mother slip the envelopes into her purse when she thought no one was looking, I realized she had been playing this game for far too long. I picked up my phone, unlocked it with shaking hands, and booked a 5-star mountain lodge on the spot. I did not even care about the cost, because for the first time in years I understood that no amount of money could match the cost of sitting in that room and letting myself be humiliated again. As soon as the booking confirmation hit my email, I screenshotted it and with a casual flick sent it into the family group chat. I did not write a single caption. I did not explain. I did not justify. I just let the image sit there, a silent announcement that I was not playing their game anymore. The moment my mother's phone buzzed, I saw her smile falter, the color in her face change ever so slightly, and I knew I had just shifted the ground beneath her feet without even raising my voice. The rest of the table carried on, oblivious, but she kept glancing at me with this tight expression like she was trying to figure out what move I had just made. And as Ethan poured himself another glass of wine and leaned back with that calm satisfaction only he can pull off, I realized I was no longer the one cornered. The rest of the evening blurred because once you stop pretending to belong, you start seeing everything clearly. The jokes no longer landed, the laughter sounded hollow, and the so-called family traditions looked more like rituals designed to keep certain people in their place. I did not fight, I did not explain, and I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Instead, I quietly excused myself, told Ethan it was time, and we headed out the door. In the back of the rideshare, as the house lights faded behind us, my phone kept buzzing with confused reactions to the screenshot. Cousins asking what it meant, an aunt asking if I was serious, my sister sending me a smirking emoji that I ignored. I turned my phone face down, leaned into Ethan, and said nothing because silence had suddenly become my sharpest weapon. And that was only the beginning, because the second I hit post on that confirmation photo, something happened that not even I expected. My mother's carefully constructed world of appearances began to shake, and I could see in her eyes that she knew exactly why that one picture terrified her more than any words I could have said. What none of them realized in that moment was that this was not just about me walking away from a dinner table. It was the first move in a game they did not even know I was about to play. And as I sat back in that car heading toward the lodge, all I could think was, if one screenshot can rattle them this badly, then what happens when the rest of the truth comes out? The car ride away from the house felt like the first full breath I had taken all day, not because the air was fresh or the scenery was beautiful, but because I could finally sit still without bracing for the next little jab disguised as a joke or the next rule disguised as tradition. And while Ethan watched the road and kept his hand over mine in that steady way that tells me he is with me even when I do not say a word, my phone kept lighting up on the seat between us with messages from the family group chat where the screenshot of the lodge confirmation had landed like a dropped plate in a quiet room, sharp and loud and followed by everyone pretending they did not hear it. I read the first wave of responses with the kind of detachment you get after years of training yourself not to react. A couple of cousins asking if we had left because of traffic or some last-minute work thing. My aunt Denise writing a paragraph that started with "Sweetheart, I am concerned," and ended with a warning about how we cannot let small things ruin a blessed day, and a string of heart reactions under a message from my sister that said she hoped I was not doing anything dramatic, which made me snort, because if there is one thing my family never recognizes, it is how quietly a person can choose to leave when she has finally learned that silence is not surrender, it is strategy. By the time we pulled up to the mountain lodge and stepped into the lobby, I had already decided that I would not explain the booking or defend the choice or give them a speech about boundaries, because I realized I did not need their permission to spend my own money on my own peace, and I did not owe a thesis to anyone who had just told me I did not belong at a table because my life did not match their checklist. I checked in under my name, took the room key, and as we rode the elevator I opened my phone and set up a simple post with a carousel of 3 photos that I would take as soon as we walked into the room, not carefully staged or filtered or meant to flex. Just proof that we were exactly where I said we would be, and I scheduled the post to go live in a few hours when I knew they would be deep into dessert and coffee and gossip, so there would be no way to pretend they had not seen it, and I toggled the audience so that it would reach the people who always claim they are out of the loop while conveniently missing the parts that are uncomfortable for them, which is to say I let it land where it needed to land and nowhere else. The room was quiet and clean and felt like a decision I should have made years ago, and while Ethan opened a bottle of water and asked if I wanted to talk about what had happened, I said that I wanted to try something different this time, which was to do nothing except tell the smallest possible truth and then let other people decide who they wanted to be in the light of it, because I am tired of writing essays that no one reads in good faith, and I am done apologizing for not having children. As if I am failing a test they invented after the grade was already assigned. So I set the phone on the table, took 3 simple photos that showed nothing more than a key card on a marble counter, a tray with 2 glasses, and a view that proved we were not at the house anymore, and I added a caption that said, "Only Thanksgiving, but peaceful," which was neither a swipe nor a taunt, just a sentence that fit in one breath and left enough space for everyone to read into it whatever they wanted. Minutes later my Aunt Denise was back, this time in the group chat, with the kind of message that sounds like compassion but lands like a lecture, telling me that leaving looked unstable and that the family fund for the new baby was a sacred little tradition I had disrespected, which made me laugh out loud because sacred is not the word you use for a jar that gets quietly rerouted when it suits the person holding it, and I typed a single reply that said, "I left because I was uninvited." Then I put the phone on mute and told Ethan I wanted to order dinner and pretend for one night that my worth is not negotiable. It should have ended there, a clean boundary and a quiet night, but the world my mother curated so carefully does not tolerate a story she cannot control, and less than an hour after I scheduled the photos, an alert popped up from a name I did not expect to see, a board member from the nonprofit committee my mother always brags about, asking politely if everything was okay, and if I had a minute to confirm something about a fundraiser, which was when the hair on my arms rose because I realized the lodge post had done more than annoy my family, it had pulled a thread in a public sweater. I called the board member back because I was curious and because I was done pretending that family matters means covering for things that do not add up, and he told me, in a voice that was careful but not unfriendly, that he had seen a photo posted earlier from my mother's account showing envelopes on a table labeled as donor matches for a charity raffle, and that some of those envelopes looked very similar to the envelopes in our kitchen jar labeled for my sister's baby fund, and he wanted to make sure there was not a misunderstanding that could become messy later. I did not accuse anyone or throw around big words or imply crimes. I just said that I would check my messages and get back to him. And when I hung up, I scrolled through my photos until I found the shot I took at the house of the jar on the counter, because I take pictures of everything, partly to remember and partly because receipts are safety when people rewrite history. And I could see the same handwriting on the jar label and on the ribbons in the fundraiser post, the same flourish on the letter F, and the same tilted loop on the Y, and while I sat there staring at the screen in a room that finally felt like mine, my phone lit up again with a new message from Pastor Hale, the family friend who always has something to say about values, asking me to please take down the lodge photos because my mother was in distress, which would have been amusing if it were not so predictable, and then, seconds later, another alert arrived, a forwarded screenshot where Pastor Hale told my sister that image mattered more than truth right now. I did not scream, I did not throw the phone, and I did not call anyone a liar. I looked at Ethan, who had been watching all of this unfold with the patience of someone who knows a fuse is burning toward something bigger. And I said that I thought the only way to handle this was to keep doing exactly what we had done so far, which was to say little and show enough, and then I opened a new note and started a simple timeline, not because I wanted a fight, but because once you choose to leave a table that claims to be about love but runs on control, you do not go back to ask for a smaller chair, you build a new room and you make sure the door is not locked from the outside. The scheduled post went live right around the time they would be passing the pumpkin pie, and the alert count on my phone jumped so fast it looked like a slot machine. Messages from cousins who had never once taken my side suddenly asking what was going on. A private text from the board member saying he had more questions, and a final call from my mother that I let go to voicemail because I wanted her to hear herself in the recording later when she tried to claim she had never said the sentence that started all of this. And as the screen kept flashing and the night thickened into that steady calm you only get when you have finally done the one thing you were afraid to do, I realized that the photo had not been a flex or a tantrum. It had been an invitation for the truth to walk into the room, and by morning it would not be knocking anymore, it would be sitting at the head of the table they told me I could not join. I woke up before sunrise not because I had set an alarm or had any place to be, but because something inside me refused to let the stillness pass without doing something with it, and as I lay in the quiet of that hotel room, warm under the heavy blankets with Ethan still asleep beside me, I found myself staring at the ceiling, going over every detail of the day before, not as a form of rumination or regret, but as if I were sifting through a puzzle, looking for pieces I had missed or corners I hadn't yet connected. It wasn't anger keeping me awake, though the anger was real and sitting just beneath my skin like a pulse. It was the awareness that for the first time, I wasn't just reacting to the insult or the slight or the usual holiday politics that I had learned to navigate since I was old enough to pour the cranberry sauce. This time, I was documenting. It would have been easy to tell myself that the whole thing was overblown, that I was just tired or sensitive or maybe even looking for a reason to walk away, but those excuses, those quiet gaslight phrases I had repeated to myself in past years, didn't stick this time, and instead I found myself opening my Photos app, scrolling slowly, and then pulling up the image I had snapped just before we left the house, the one of the jar with the label written in my mother's unmistakable cursive, the one she uses for invitations and thank you notes and formal things she wants people to believe carry meaning. The jar said Family Fund, Baby Joy, and it had those same curled letters, the same ribbon color she used in the photos she had posted earlier that week on her nonprofit's Facebook page, a page she had added me to years ago even though I never liked anything on it because something about the whole thing always felt a little too performative, a little too curated, like everything she shared was less about impact and more about image. I flipped back and forth between the jar photo and the nonprofit's raffle flyer. Same handwriting, same twine, even the same table runner if you looked close enough. And that's when it hit me that this wasn't just about a family dinner or exclusion, or even about me being told I didn't belong. It was about money, specifically about how money was being collected in one context and presented in another, with just enough overlap to raise questions if anyone started looking too closely. And someone already had. The board member who had messaged me, his name was Derek, wasn't just being polite when he asked if I could confirm a few things. He was probing, gently but firmly. And I got the sense that this wasn't his first time dealing with something that smelled off beneath a layer of well-lit photos and vague fundraising language. He had written, "I know this might feel out of the blue, but we've had a few people ask how the raffle donors were selected, and I realized some of the envelope styles in your mother's post match the ones tagged in your personal photo from Thanksgiving. Could you clarify how they were distributed?" That word, clarify, carried the kind of weight that doesn't need to be loud to land hard, and I knew immediately that if I didn't respond, the story would be told without me. So I opened a new note, not to write a statement or build a case like a lawyer might, but to build a clean, chronological timeline with screenshots and names removed. Just facts. This envelope appeared here. That jar was present there. This message was sent on that date because if there's anything I've learned about people like my mother, it's that they depend on others being too scattered or too emotionally overwhelmed to track details. But if you calmly lay out receipts, they either crumble or pivot, and I was ready for either outcome. Ethan, now awake and sipping his coffee, didn't ask what I was doing, didn't tell me to slow down or warn me not to escalate things. He just said, "Want me to proof it before you send it?" And that one sentence, as casual as it was, reminded me why I had chosen him, why I had married someone who understood that support doesn't always come with fanfare or big gestures. Sometimes it's just knowing when to pass the baton and when to help you carry it across the line. I sent the timeline file to Derek with a short message that said, "Thought this might help you answer your board's questions," and nothing else. No editorializing, no emotion, just what he had asked for and nothing more. He responded within 15 minutes with a thank you and a promise to follow up, and while that might have been the end of it for the day, the real signal that things were about to shift came from an entirely different direction. Pastor Hale, yes, the same family friend who had messaged me to take down my lodge photo for the sake of my mother's distress, sent me a long, meandering voice note that started with how complicated family dynamics can be and ended with a suggestion that I let this one go for peace, which would have been infuriating if it hadn't also arrived just seconds after I received a forwarded message from my sister, a screenshot of Hale telling her that we need to clean this up fast or your mother might lose her committee seat. That was the moment I realized it wasn't just about money or image or a seat at a dinner table. It was about control, and it was about fear. Because people don't start scrambling like that unless they know there's something beneath the surface that won't survive being dragged into the light. And so I did something that surprised even me. I didn't reply to Hale. I didn't forward the message to anyone else. I didn't scream or post or threaten or even hint. I just opened a new folder, labeled it Thanksgiving, and dropped everything in. Every screenshot. Every message. Every photo. Because what I knew then, without a doubt, was that I no longer needed to argue for my seat at any table. I had already started building my own, and if they wanted to keep pretending that tradition meant silence and loyalty meant blindness, then they would have to do it without me, and maybe, for the first time, without the cover of shadows. The morning arrived with a strange quiet that felt heavier than usual, the kind of silence that carries tension in its weight, and as I stepped into the living room to find my husband reviewing some documents at the kitchen table, the faint smell of coffee mingled with the lingering anxiety of yesterday's revelations, reminding me that while the world outside continued as if nothing had happened, inside, nothing could ever be the same again. And every casual glance from Ethan reinforced the silent agreement that we were no longer just observers in a family drama that had always been subtle, but now demanded a response that was precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. I had spent the early hours organizing my thoughts, reviewing the receipts I had gathered, not as ammunition in some petty fight, but as a map to navigate the territory that had long been controlled by appearances, half-truths, and selective generosity. And I realized that the confrontation I had avoided my entire life was no longer something I could put off under the guise of politeness or obligation, because the consequences of inaction had already begun to ripple outward, touching not just my pride or my sense of fairness, but the financial and social threads that held the carefully constructed image of my family together. When I finally arrived at my mother's house, the tension was palpable, not in the obvious way, through raised voices or dramatic gestures, but in the stillness that hovered over the room, a quiet that had been cultivated over decades, the sort of calm that pretends everything is fine while everyone waits for someone else to speak first. And as soon as my mother saw me, her expression shifted slightly, a fleeting flash of recognition that she knew I had not come to nod, smile, or accept platitudes, but to confront a reality she had long ignored, and I could see it in the way her hands tightened around the teacup she had prepared as a customary gesture of civility. My sister, perched on the edge of the couch with her phone forgotten in her lap, glanced at me with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty, as if she were aware that whatever unfolded next would determine not only our roles in the family hierarchy, but also how each of us would be perceived by the outside world. And I realized that every subtle look, every quiet adjustment of posture, was part of a language I had been reading all my life without truly understanding until now. I started by speaking calmly, deliberately, recounting the events of the previous day, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, describing the way the baby shower had unfolded, the precise words my mother had used, the laughter, the papers Ethan had revealed, and the stunned silence that had followed. And while I knew she would attempt to deflect, to minimize, or even to rewrite the memory in her favor, I had prepared for this by having everything documented, every image, every message, every email, every post, meticulously organized and ready to present, because I understood that when someone is confronted with evidence that challenges their carefully maintained narrative, their instinct is often to attack the messenger. But there is a limit to how far facts can be denied when they are irrefutable, and I intended to reach that limit today. As I laid the documents out on the coffee table, my mother's hands trembled slightly, a subtle signal of vulnerability I had rarely seen, and she began her habitual responses, the softening phrases, the reminders of tradition, the appeals to family harmony. But I did not waver, allowing the papers to speak louder than words, and I watched as her composure faltered incrementally with each detail I presented. The contrast between her curated public persona and the factual record I had compiled becoming increasingly undeniable, while my sister's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to quiet concern, realizing that the simple act of documentation had appended the story she had thought she controlled. Ethan, sitting beside me, remained silent but steady, a quiet anchor in a room where tension threatened to fracture the space, and I realized that his presence was more than support. It was affirmation that the life we were building together, separate from the manipulations and the selective generosity that had always defined my family, mattered more than any ritual or expectation they tried to impose. And as my mother's voice grew quieter, more fragmented, I understood that the confrontation was no longer about words or gestures, but about the undeniable power of transparency and preparation, about the shift from passive acceptance to deliberate action. And as I gathered the papers, having allowed the weight of evidence to settle where it would, I recognized that this moment marked a profound turning point, not because of any victory over my mother or sister, but because I had finally reclaimed control over my own narrative. And in that reclamation lay a quiet, unassailable strength that would shape every interaction moving forward, a strength that no laughter, no whispered justification, and no curated display of need or favor could ever diminish. And as we left the house, the tension remained, yes, but it had transformed into something far more manageable, a clear understanding that the rules had changed, that the leverage had shifted, and that the quiet power of preparation, documentation, And calm assertion had not only created resolution, but also established the framework for boundaries that would protect the next generation from the same manipulations I had endured. The days that followed the confrontation unfolded with a strange, almost surreal rhythm, as if the universe had shifted slightly on its axis, leaving me to navigate a reality that was familiar in appearance, but fundamentally altered in structure and expectation. And while I had anticipated relief, satisfaction, or even vindication, what I encountered instead was a complex blend of tension, introspection, and unexpected revelations that forced me to reassess not only my relationships, but also the patterns of behavior that had allowed these dynamics to persist for so long without challenge. And I realized that the aftermath was never about a singular moment of triumph, but about the ongoing negotiation of boundaries, respect, and accountability in a system that had long prioritized appearances over honesty. When I returned home, the quiet of our apartment felt simultaneously comforting and isolating, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere I had left behind. And as I watched Ethan methodically organize his workspace while our child napped in the adjacent room, I felt the weight of responsibility settle across my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a tangible reminder that the stakes were higher than they had ever been. That our choices in those preceding hours had rippled outward in ways that could not be contained, and that the act of speaking truth to power, as uncomfortable and risky as it had been, was only the beginning of a broader journey towards self-determination and familial recalibration, one that demanded patience, vigilance, and the courage to sustain clarity even when provocation or manipulation threatened to undermine it. My mother, in the days following the confrontation, adopted a tone of cautious civility that felt deliberate and measured, the kind of politeness that carries an undercurrent of calculation, and while she made gestures toward normalcy, checking in with calls, offering unsolicited advice on baby care, and attempting to include me in social routines, I could sense the subtle shifts in intention, the strategic recalibrations designed to preserve control without appearing overtly coercive, and it became evident that the real struggle was no longer about overt denial or argument, but about navigating a landscape of unspoken power, where influence was exerted through implication, selective generosity, and the silent expectation that I would conform to a set of behaviors and values that no longer aligned with my own. My sister, who had once approached family gatherings with a sense of entitlement and unspoken superiority, seemed to oscillate between tentative attempts at reconciliation and obvious self-interest, her behavior reflecting a mixture of learned instinct and conscious strategy, and I understood that while she had assumed she would continue to operate within a system that reinforced her advantages, the events of the baby shower and the subsequent confrontation had disrupted those assumptions irrevocably, leaving her to reconsider how her actions were perceived and how easily the carefully constructed narratives she relied upon could be dismantled with clarity, preparation, and unwavering attention to detail. And while I did not desire conflict, I recognized that her recalibration was necessary for establishing a more equitable dynamic, one that would prevent the repeated exploitation of my trust, resources, and patience. In our home, conversations with Ethan evolved in a new rhythm, a cadence marked by shared reflection, mutual strategizing, and the quiet affirmation of alignment that had been tested under extraordinary pressure. And I came to appreciate the profound difference between alliances rooted in convenience or obligation and those forged through deliberate observation, shared experience, and unwavering integrity. And as we discussed long-term plans for our family, finances, and parenting approach, I realized that the confrontation had served as an unintentional litmus test, revealing not only the character of those around us, but also clarifying the values that would guide our decisions moving forward, creating a foundation that prioritized transparency, accountability, and mutual respect over appeasement or social niceties. The community around us, extended family, friends, and colleagues, began to respond in subtle ways, offering support, validation, or at times, unspoken acknowledgement of the upheaval that had occurred. And it became evident that while some relationships would adapt and strengthen under the weight of truth, others would fracture or withdraw, and I recognized that such outcomes, while uncomfortable, were necessary for the establishment of a network of interactions built on authenticity rather than convenience, obligation, or performative loyalty, and as I observed the shifting patterns of engagement, I felt a cautious optimism, tempered by realism, that the recalibrated environment would ultimately be healthier for everyone involved, especially for the next generation who would inherit a family dynamic less defined by favoritism, selective generosity, and unspoken manipulation, and more by clarity, integrity, and conscious choice. In the quiet moments, as I reflected on the sequence of events from the baby shower through the confrontation and into the aftermath, I understood that the most profound change had occurred within myself, not merely in the reactions of others, and that the reclamation of my voice, the deliberate assertion of boundaries, and the meticulous documentation of reality had created a sense of agency I had not experienced before. An empowerment that allowed me to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics with a confidence that was measured, deliberate, and resilient, and while the echoes of past frustration and disappointment remained, they were now reframed as lessons rather than burdens, providing insight, perspective, and a foundation for proactive, thoughtful action in all future interactions. And as I held my child in my arms, feeling the quiet warmth of family life rebuilt on new terms, I realized that the culmination of these events was not a singular resolution, but an ongoing commitment to clarity, fairness, and the unapologetic assertion of one's own value, and that in this realization lay the truest measure of victory, one that no amount of laughter, denial, or selective generosity could ever diminish.